careful when you applaud before somebody speaks, because you may not like what they're saying. I'm delighted to be here, and I think it's wonderful, echo what Carl said, to see this turnout tonight. We were talking earlier that apparently there's a seat count of 66 of these seats were available, and obviously we have that many folks here and maybe more, so it's a real delight. I'm going to forego a jacket tonight. I hope that's okay with everybody, just a tad warm. To set this into context, historic preservation in the U.S. dates from the 1850s, and it began when a group of women got together to save an old house. And this was a pre-revolutionary house that was slated to be torn down and replaced by what we would think of as a resort hotel. And this group of women got together, formed an organization, acquired the property in the 1850s, and were it not for this group of women, Mount Vernon would have been lost. So that kind of set us up as far as where historic preservation started. And actually, the Mount Vernon Ladies Society of the Union still owns the building, you know, more than 150 years later. And of course, not everything in preservation, even early on, was successful. John Hancock's house in Boston was lost. The Boston State House was saved. Paul Revere House underwent lots of changes, but it's still there. And so initially, historic preservation looked at the houses of great people. And that was pretty much the impetus early on, probably for the first 75 or so years. Revolutionary War heroes, presidents, state heroes, military leaders, things like that. And then in the 1920s, John D. Rockefeller went to what was left of Williamsburg, the capital of Virginia, colonial capital, and liked what he saw. And being John D., he bought it and began a restoration and reconstruction of colonial Williamsburg, much of which, of course, if you've been there, they interpret it very well, much of which is reconstruction. There's not a whole lot of original buildings there. And that was really the first time that people looked at preservation as being focused upon groups of buildings. And then in the 1930s, people in Charleston and Savannah and New Orleans looked at their groups of buildings, their historic districts, passed the first pieces of landmarks legislation to protect them. And then by the 1960s, we were going through urban renewal, federal program that cleared thousands of buildings just because they were not in good condition. It was pretty much a crashing failure nationally. But what it did spur was the passage in 1966 of the National Historic Preservation Act, the federal legislation that for the first time declared historic preservation to be national policy. It was part of Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. And with the passage of the Preservation Act of '66 came the establishment of the National Register of Historic Places, came the creation of grants that could go to states who could then pass them on to municipalities like the town of Old Saybrook, and this process started. Then in the 70s, we began to look more and more at historic districts. We began to look at historic downtowns because, of course, development pressure in historic downtowns is probably greater than in most places. And the federal government set up a program to provide tax incentives for the rehabilitation of historic buildings. There are brochures back here on the table. I encourage you to take one home and read it. We're not going to spend an evening talking about tax incentives because you'd go running out the door. But there are state tax incentives as well as federal tax incentives. And the State Historic Preservation Office up in Hartford, they have a great website. Look at it, understand it, because it is applicable here. So what we did, excuse me, when we were fortunate enough to be selected to do this project about a year or so ago, and it would have happened quicker, except I ended up getting a hip replacement, and that wasn't any fun at all for about 6 weeks. So we kind of had to back our schedule up. But we looked, based on a list that Christine and Ted provided, we looked at about 230 some buildings. So, I do want to say this, by the way. The only rules here is there are no rules. If you have questions, don't wait till the end. If you have comments, if you want to say, why did you say that? What we're going to do is to look at some of the things that came out of the report. We're not, obviously, I mean, you all gasped when you saw the pile of paper that the survey took. So we're not, oh, thank you.
You're welcome.
We're not going to talk about individual properties. We're going to talk about generalities. The survey will be put online through the City Land Use Department. It is filed with the Historical Society also. That's where Ted got his little baby volume that he had in his hand. And it will also, of course, go to the State Historic Preservation Office too. So eventually you'll be able to see it. Now, it's a survey, it's an inventory. It's not in-depth research on every building, because it wasn't, for the scale of a project like this, you can't do that. But it's general research, it's commenting on the historic character of the buildings, it comments on, it's a form that the state has. It includes a photo of each building, sometimes more than one. It has an architectural description, it has a description of the physical environment, and then it has a continuation sheet with pictures for each of the 230 some properties. So that will be available online. Any questions so far? Good, good. So, nope, I don't, thanks. I was afraid that would happen. Okay. 233 properties plus dependencies, garages, barns. We didn't, if you couldn't see it from the public right away, we didn't photograph it because we didn't want to trespass. Varieties of different uses, residential, commercial, institutional, like churches, religious, institutional, like schools, the high school here, for example, institutional, like the library, the old Acton Library, and governmental, and commemorative. Commemorative, like the Yale boulder. Commemorative, like the statue up here. That, you know, those are, they're not buildings, but they're objects and structures that are important to the history of the community. And so we documented them as well. Never fails. Went the wrong way. That's why the thing's upside down. We identified a series of property types. Domestic architecture, including wood frame houses, brick houses, and domestic dependencies. The dependency could be a 1920s garage or an 1880s carriage house. And as you well know, we have several wonderful barns still in the town as well. Mercantile architecture, commercial buildings along in the downtown district, as well as industrial property. Industrial property like the trolley barn, like the Ferry Point powerhouse, that are historic industrial examples of resources here in town. Institutional architecture, including religious, churches, educational architecture, and governmental architecture. And structures and objects such as the commemorative statuary and monuments that I mentioned earlier. Those were the property types that we identified. Sorry.
I'd be happy to push the
Would
button in
you?
the future if you
Yeah, I think it's this
either
one.
point the remote at me and I'll,
And raise your hands, right? Yeah.
I'll push the button.
I'd appreciate that. I don't know why it was working earlier, but yeah, if you do the next one, please. Whoop, other way.
Wrong way, okay.
Okay,
I needed a little training.
not a problem. On-the-job training, thank you. Architectural styles, and this is not an exhaustive list, but these are the primary styles that we identified within the town. From the pre-revolutionary period, the early Cape Cods that are all around the community, and some Georgian style houses, big 4/4 Georgian plan houses. And then in the Republican period, after the war, federal was the first national style that developed in the U.S. And we have a number of federal style houses, lots of them in North Cove, and others scattered around. Greek Revival, which includes the gable front temple form houses with a 3-bay facade and a doorway offset, and classically derived ornamentation. Louder, please. Okay. Gothic Revival, which is a revival of medieval architecture that most often is seen in churches. We have some of those. And also in domestic architecture, where we see the use of the pointed arched window, the Gothic style window. And there's not many of those here in town, but they are represented. Italianate is kind of your typical Victorian house, with a bracketed cornice, tall window proportions, sometimes broad verandas, and these verandas often incorporate Eastlake style trim, which is the turned ornament, turned on a lathe, that has like an upper balustrade, lower balustrade, turned posts. That's Eastlake style. Shingle style is the shingle finish that is typical of late 19th and early 20th century, wood shingle finish, and it really carried up into much later time too. Neoclassical Revival was kind of a revival of the Greek Revival in the late 1890s, and it continued on domestic architecture as well as commercial architecture, institutional architecture, lots of banks for the substantial type of construction that put the word that this was a solid bank, because it looked like a neoclassical temple. Of course, in 1929 we found some of those weren't also solid either. But next one, please. Then 20th century architecture, Colonial Revival. The Colonial Revival started in the 1870s with the 1876 Philadelphia Centennial, and it brought in a rekindled patriotism in the wake of the American Centennial, and the architecture that developed in some cases were faithful replications of colonial design. In other cases, just borrowed some colonial features, like a Palladian window that they'd stick up in a gable, and Palladian windows, the round arch window with shorter flat-topped windows on each side, and there are lots of those in town here too. Craftsman style, based on a lot of the work of Stickley, Gustav Stickley, and the Green brothers, two brothers architects from California. Bungalows, low-scale craftsman-style cottages. The American Foursquare isn't really a style, but it's a property type, and it basically is a square house, typically with a pyramidal roof, often with dormers, a porch that runs across the front, very little ornament, but think about every street in town. There are many American Foursquares, and they were probably the most popular style from 1910 to 1930, and they were built everywhere. Minimal traditional is a style that is similar to a ranch style, but with less gable overhang. Sometimes ranch-style houses typically are just rectangular. Minimal traditional styles are often rectangular with a wing. It's a mid-century modern style that developed in the 1930s up into the 1950s. Ranch style, we all know about ranch styles. One story, hip roof, usually broad overhangs. Now a lot of these buildings in the late 20th century had integral garages too, because that was a social function. All of a sudden we had cars. And instead of detached garages, they were integrated into the design of the building. So sometimes we see that. Industrial vernacular. Vernacular is a term that refers to buildings built typically without the use of an architect, sometimes just built by local craftsmen following local traditions in terms of design. The industrial vernacular, the two that come to mind are the trolley barn and the Ferry Point powerhouse, which of course, as I think you probably all know, maybe you don't, the powerhouse has received a grant to do a real estate study, and it has been determined eligible for the National Register by the State Historic Preservation Office. So that's real exciting, because that's a big chunk of old Saybrook history right there. If you would, please. So the National Register, talked about that a little bit ago, and it was mentioned, Diane mentioned it, that the age threshold for National Register designation is 50 years. I have the same reaction that you do. But if we hadn't been preserving these buildings in the 60s and 70s that were 50 years old, we might have lost wonderful bungalow neighborhoods. And so it's a matter of kind of stepping back and saying, okay, yeah, it was built in 1965, but you need to look at the context and look at what makes a building distinctive. And there has to be an age criteria someplace, and so that's what the National Park Service came up with. There are 4 criteria for National Register designation. One is properties that are associated with important events, places where something happened. The next one is properties that are associated with lives of people who are significant in our past, who made a difference. Now, National Register designation has 3 levels, and they're not really hierarchical levels, but there, of course, are national properties of national importance. There are properties of statewide importance, and the most properties listed in the National Register by far are for local significance. So when you look around at the districts that you have here and the individual properties that are listed in the National Register, they're more than likely not of statewide or national significance, but they certainly are significant locally. And so that's the way that process works. Next one, please. Criterion C is the one for architecture, that properties that have distinctive physical characteristics, represent important styles, were built or designed by major figures in the design field or leading contractors. That's what most properties are nominated for. And then D strictly deals with archaeology. And that's probably the fewest properties that are nominated, the properties that might yield information. Now, of course, the fort site up here would have been nominated under criterion D, because there wasn't anything left except they did excavations and they found things there. So, next one, please. Integrity is something that the National Register requires, that a property or a district have integrity, and it's these 6 or 7 different qualities: location, design, setting, materials, workmanship, feeling, and association. Not all districts and not all properties need to have every one, but they need to embody as a composite those qualities. Next one. This is just a list of the properties in Old Saybrook that are on the National Register now. And it's as current as I could get from the State Historic Preservation Office website. Properties like the Black Horse Tavern, Remember, the National Register started out in 1966, and it was nominated in 1978. And then different properties, the Railroad Roundhouse, Fenwick Historic District, which of course Fenwick's a separate borough, but it's right here anyway. Next one, please. And I know this gets small, but this is all in the report, and the report will be online also. James Pharmacy, you know, a very important local property for African American and women's history. The North Cove Historic District, that was listed in 1994. The old Saybrook South Green Historic District that goes back to 1976. And lighthouses, a couple of lighthouses that were put on the National Register as part of a multiple property nomination that nominated lots and lots of lighthouses in Connecticut. Next one, please. We also identified properties that appear eligible for the National Register under Criterion C for architecture, and perhaps under Criterion A for their association with individuals important to the history of the community. National Register designation is quite a lengthy process. It requires lots of research. So what we did was basically look at the exterior physical characteristics of this list of buildings. If you do the next one, and this, I'm sorry this is so small, but a number on Boston Post Road, some on College Street, Cromwell Place, the Ferry Point Powerhouse, some on Main Street, some on Old Boston Post Road. This will all be in the report too that you'll be able to see. So, recommendations. What are we going to do with all this stuff? First, we recommend that there is National Register recommendations are offered. Now this list and the previous slide, keep in mind this is far from exhaustive because this survey was a reconnaissance level survey looking all over town. So there were areas that just because of the scale of this project we couldn't look at. Now, as Diane said, you know, maybe there's going to be another survey in another area of the town. And that's the way that this process typically works. We are recommending that the old Saybrook South Green Historic District, which is listed in the National Register, that it be expanded to include more of Pennywise Lane, Old Boston Post Road, portions of Main and College Streets. These areas contain a really fine collection of historic properties that many of whom weren't looked at back in the 70s when this was done. And many of them now have reached that 50-year threshold. So we're suggesting that consideration be given to expanding that historic district. We're going to run through this fairly quick. I don't want to keep you here forever. Let's continue the survey process, looking at different areas of town, looking at different neighborhoods, keeping in mind the 50-year period, looking at I did a National Register nomination in outside of Kansas City a couple of years ago in the town of Lee's Summit. And it was a historic district that consisted of a 1948 subdivision. And, you know, they were a lot of ranch-style houses, some Cape Cods, and it was laid out purposefully in 1948, and it was listed in the National Register. So continue the survey process. Work with the State Historic Preservation Office to identify other areas for survey activity. And there is the grant funding is available every year. It's an open application period. Another kind of National Register nomination is a thematic nomination. And Ted Levy wrote a wonderful book called Remarkable Women of Old Saybrook. And it might be a possibility to do a thematic nomination on the houses associated with those women. Now, some of those are in Fenwick, but thematic nominations follow the resources rather than geographical boundaries. seek funding to prepare what's called a multiple property documentation form for the town. Now that's a cover document that explains architectural history, that explains historic themes, that sets up registration requirements, and does lots of research. And then what it does, when that's done, it makes subsequent nominations to the National Register much easier because that documentation has already been done. You're not reinventing the wheel. A lot of this stuff is fundable through the CLG grant, too. Okay. We need to promote widespread awareness of the historic areas in the town, to not only to the local folks, but to tourists. So you have a wonderful tourist economy here. But we're suggesting that in order to do that, some distinctive street signs be developed. If you'd hit the next one, please. Whoops. Distinctive street signs be developed that say Historic District or say Old South Green Historic District or something like that, different from your conventional garden variety street crossing signs, to say, hey, this is a special place. Interpretive historical panels, it could be and plaques. Now you have some name and date plaques all over town, of course, but consider the installation of interpretive historical panels that could incorporate historic photos, streetscape views, and some text to interpret the various vistas that appear on each of the panels. If you do the next one. Here's an example that focuses on one building. Historic photo, picture of the guy who built it. It's an opera house in my town in Pennsylvania. Here's a stage picture from the 1890s and some text about what it is. Next one. Here's one about an entire downtown using historic photos, some postcard views, some text, and it describes this one particular downtown. Okay. Excuse me. School age education. Preservation education is so important. And if we don't educate the kids, we won't have advocates down through the years. So we're suggesting that working with the school district, with the historical society, with the town, with the historic district commission, that putting together some kind of a program for local history. And one way that we've used is a coloring book. Next one, please. This is a coloring book that was done for a small town in eastern Pennsylvania, where James Buchanan was born, and this was the Buchanan House in Mercersburg, PA. And it has a picture of it. It has descriptions of the architectural styles. It has a little historical information, and it was designed with a study guide for fourth graders. And the kids, that's when they do local PA history, is in the fourth grade. So the kids go downtown and color the landmarks. And they study what a cornice is and what a storefront is and things like that. So that when they begin to look at historic buildings, they may have more of an appreciation of them. And you folks have, well, you've got 2,000 buildings built before 1965, so you certainly have plenty to pick from. But a wonderful repertoire of historic architecture here. Next one. We're suggesting that thought be given to setting up an Old Saybrook History Day, encouraging people to bring in their historic photos, come in with recollections, have a scanner handy to scan historic photos, because once the historic photos are lost, you know, that's a chunk of history that we won't ever get back. This would be something that we would certainly suggest that the Historical Society would be involved with, and maybe have the event either here, which is a great venue that I didn't know about till tonight, or at the Archives building, and get people to come in and talk about their town. Maybe have somebody there with a tape recorder doing oral history interviews. but get people to be thinking about the history of their town. Now, some of this is more municipal, but the Historic District Commission, working with the Historical Society, may wish to establish a preservation award program. You may also want to think about having an endangered places recognition so that people can be aware that there are places that are endangered. The National Trust for Historic Preservation, any members here? Good. They do the 11 most endangered buildings in the country every year. And it's different every year, and it draws attention to those buildings. We're hoping that the Historic District Commission will encourage local government to become active partners in historic preservation, staying abreast of issues that affect historic preservation, and to the extent that they're able to do this is another thing that's fundable through the CLG grant, to develop a historic preservation plan for the entire town. How are we going to preserve the town of Old Saybrook? Nothing that has injunctive power, but just a plan that says, we need to do this, 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 and this to preserve the historic character of our town. We want to get the benefits of the National Register out on the street, because you have two historic districts here. It's Old South Green and North Cove. And we're suggesting that the Historic District Commission put together a piece that's disseminated out to property owners in those districts. And of course, there are also properties that are individually listed, to get the information out so that everybody knows what the National Register is, what the National Register isn't. And that's probably the most important thing to talk about briefly. There are two kinds of historic districts. One is like North Cove, that's a local historic district, and which happens also to be on the National Register. But the Old South Green Historic District is a National Register historic district. Local historic districts typically have some kind of design guidelines. National Register designation carries with it no design control at all, but it does carry forth these tax incentives that I talked about earlier. So National Register District is not a scary thing. Local designation is up to the local community, the Board of Selectmen. The National Register is not an arduous designation at all. We're suggesting that the District Commission consider creating a pamphlet and website relative both to the South Green Historic District and the North Cove Historic District. Get the information out. Okay? Other published materials might include the Main Street Walking Tour, development of a bike tour that could tie in from Railroad Junction down to Main Street, Old Boston Post Road, Maple Avenue, a biking and walking tour of the historic district. As we said earlier, Old Saybrook is a certified local government, and it may be something that should be considered to change the body's name from Historic District Commission to Historic Preservation Commission, because it does look at more than just historic districts. It's what you do, quick, next one, with what you've got. That's what it boils down to. Now, I'm just going to run through a couple from my little town in Pennsylvania, a town of less than 4,000 people, small. We started our Main Street project and our historic preservation efforts in 1983. Next one, please. We're a Victorian town. We're on Interstate 80, so that of course makes a difference. We're a county seat. You can see the courthouse in the background. So that adds something to the economy. But we're definitely, the town was laid out in 1830, so it's just a kid compared to you folks. Had a couple of major fires in the downtown. That was our answer to urban renewal in the 1880s. And when they rebuilt in the Victorian periods. It's our courthouse. 1866 courthouse that 2 years ago had a $5 million restoration done by the county. County government did it, and it won state awards. It's the paperweight of the downtown. And just a couple of examples of treatments. Paint. Paint is such an incredibly important and dramatic treatment. What we encourage is for people to pick paint colors that are period appropriate to the period of the building and place them as they would have been placed historically. Quite a change. Now people, we think of the big white Victorian houses. In that period, houses were painted a multitude of colors. And the movement to all white, I think, grew from the Columbian Exposition of 1893 in Chicago, when all the architecture of that World's Fair was white. And I think that's my opinion. That's what changed the proclivity for multicolored houses. There's some wonderful literature on historic paint colors. If you go online and look up Roger Moss, he's written several books on Victorian paint colors, and they're very good. This is an 1890s house that became a funeral home and had been painted white, like everything else, for many, many years. And so the funeral director, this is in the 1980s, decided he wanted to repaint, and I was the Main Street manager, and he was on my board, so I kind of put the screws to him, and he was not real thrilled with doing a multicolored paint scheme on his funeral home. But we came up with a paint color combination that in the 1880 Sherwin-Williams catalog was described as quiet and restful. You got my point. Didn't even have to lead you into that. And so this is what it turned out to be. Paint is so dramatic. Okay. This is a building, an 1870s building that was empty on our main street. A county agency bought it. The County Area Agency on Aging bought it, did some fundraising, got some grants, and turned it into this. About 60 jobs moved into that building on Main Street, in the downtown. And if you think about industrial recruitment or commercial recruitment, what recruiter or what industrial developer wouldn't love to have something come in with 50 jobs? And here we have 50 jobs in a downtown building right in the middle of the downtown. This is a painted brick building with an 1880s addition. We cleaned the paint, not sandblasting. Sandblasting, if you haven't been lectured to about that before, sandblasting is the worst thing you can do to historic masonry. There are ways to clean it. And then using paint. Right beside the courthouse, our nonprofit is going to break ground in the spring for a public park in the downtown. It was on the site of a hotel that came down in the 1960s, replaced by a gas station. Sounds familiar? The gas station closed about 8 years ago, and our nonprofit optioned it, bought it, went through 7 or 8 years of environmental remediation because of underground tanks, and then raised about $700,000 of private and public money to build this town square right beside the courthouse. Little dark, this is our opera house. 1886 opera house. This is our next project. We're very ambitious. We work outside the box, and we've been doing this in our town for more than 30 years now. Let's look at just a couple of white elephants, and I think about the powerhouse as an example. The next one. This is a building in Harrisburg, our state capital, that started out as a farmhouse in the 1860s, and then in the 1880s, the Catholic bishop bought it and put this colonnade around it, and it was the bishop's residence And then by the time the 1990s came along, you couldn't even see it from the road because of the overgrowth. The Redevelopment Authority of Harrisburg turned it over to the Harrisburg YWCA, and whoops, there it is now. It's just like a $5.5 million project that got tax credits, that is now the headquarters for the greater Harrisburg YWCA, a women's shelter, and obviously quite a change from that original appearance. Another one, please. This is a similar project. This is in Trenton, New Jersey, the YWCA in Trenton. Doesn't look that big, but you had a preview of it. The next one. Pretty good sized building. That was another one of those tax credit projects in a historic district. It's what you do with what you've got. Any questions? Yeah.
So a couple minutes ago, you were referring to things at your Opera House as our next project.
Mhm.
So when you're talking about we did this and
Our nonprofit called Historic Brookville Incorporated.
I see.
It was incorporated in 1982 to run the Main Street program. And I'm a native, but I've been away for about 20 years, so they forgot what I was like. And they invited me back to run the downtown program. Yeah.
You didn't mention cemeteries, and are they in a different category? Because some of them are very, very historic.
Cemeteries are in a different category. There's a criteria consideration in the National Register for cemeteries. And there's a definite, now if we were to if you were to continue with this historic district expansion that we mentioned, would likely take in the old cemetery. So cemeteries can be contributing properties in a historic district, but to nominate them individually, you have to meet these criteria consideration. Yeah.
I own one of the oldest homes in Saybrook. I own 500 Main Street, the Samuel Elliott House.
Mhm.
And I'm having the front of the house redone because it was really needing to be.
Is it the red house?
Yes.
Okay, I drove it, I
Yes,
saw it this
yes.
afternoon.
So when the workers were sort of removing the old wood and
Uh-huh.
that, there were corn cobs in there
Oh, really?
that were used for
Insulation?
insulation.
Wow,
And then
that's wild.
And another thing too, some years back, when we were doing another part of the house,
Mhm.
there were slave captains who owned the house in the 1800s, and we were taking off one part of the house, and I climbed a ladder and I was looking, and I saw these circles, like cut out circles in the wood, like behind the clapboards.
Mhm.
I climbed and I'm feeling behind there, and I feel hay. And I felt a bird skeleton. So this was where the carrier pigeons were,
that's
because
wild.
North Cove used to be a deep
Yeah.
water,
Sure.
and that's where the boats used
Oh,
to
yeah.
be.
I'm gonna sit, nobody mind.
Isn't that wild?
Oh, I think that's great.
Yeah, yeah.
Taylor, you've spoken too long. No, I guess. Is there any area in Old Saybrook that could qualify as an historic district in addition to the North Cove area? Well, of course, we have the old South Green district, and we're suggesting that it could be expanded. So yes, I mean, that's the short answer. The other answer is, we don't know yet, because, the town hasn't really been completely surveyed or investigated. There may be 1955 subdivisions that are eligible. You'll see in the report when it's online, there are two pictures. One, there was a series of wonderful aerials taken in the 1930s, and then they took them again in the 1970s. The Department of Agriculture did this. And one of them from Old Saybrook shows a lot of that lower College Street on that side as being cornfields, farmland at that time. And then by 1960, here we have streets and alleys and houses. So yeah, I mean, it's a process, you know, we can't just say there's nothing else eligible, because we know that's not the case. Did that answer that question? Okay, yeah.
So, as a result of your survey, were there some surprises or some highlights that you'd like to share with us?
Oh boy, I think this whole town's a highlight. I mean, as Ted was saying in the beginning, I've been at this for a while and worked in a half a dozen states. I think just the little interesting things, I'm a fan of, I love Victorian architecture. I live in a house my great-granddad built in 1882, so yeah, I know about it. But I think mid-century modern architecture is fascinating. Things that you know, were post-war. Yes, they might have been built in the 1950s, but you know, that's part of our architectural history too. You know, I think you're so lucky to have such a fabulous historical society here too. And not every community is blessed to have that kind of an institution with, and Ted didn't pay me to say this, with, you know, with dedicated volunteers like you have here. And programs and things like that. The Kate is just a tremendous asset. We're thinking of our opera house as being that tremendous asset when it's done. Yeah.
You talked about grants and tax credits. Are
Mhm.
they available to individual house owners, or is that more for commercial and public?
The federal tax incentives are available for income-producing properties, which includes residential rental. Okay? So if you own a double, and I don't know if this applies to anybody, if you own a double, live in half of it, rent the other half. And you need to work on that other half, that's the rental, that's an income-producing property.
Gee, I should rent a room out there.
There you go, there you go. I'm not gonna, I'm not gonna tell anybody you said that, but, the state tax credits are available, also. And that's where I encourage you to go online and get this fly out of my hair. There's not much to land on up there.
He's attracted to you.
Yeah, apparently, yeah.
One of the great fears that people have when we talk about historic districts is once an area is made a historic district, you're controlled in what you can do in the area.
Mhm.
And we have several areas, and I mean, we have more than several, we have dozens of areas in Old Saybrook where there is conglomeration of very old houses, especially along the water.
Yep.
And now some of them being torn down and rebuilt and everything. And what would turning those into historic districts do to the people that want to rebuild? Or
That totally depends on how you write your local ordinance. If you write it to control demolition, if you write it to, and I never advise this, if you write it to control a paint palette, don't do that ever. I mean, Roger Moss, that I mentioned earlier, is a good friend of mine, and I've heard him speak many times, and he said the worst paint color in the combination in the world is one coat of paint away from being the best. So it depends on how you write your ordinance. Yeah.
Maybe you could point out the difference between a national historic district
Okay.
and a local.
I started into that and maybe didn't finish it. A National Register District, which is what you have in,
it really is.
go get a broom and just rap me on the head if he comes by. National Register District carries with it no design control, zero. The only time that there's any oversight with a National Register District is if there is federal money involved. A local ordinance district is the other kind, and that's what we have in North Cove, that there is a local ordinance that does advise and control, I suppose, exterior changes to properties. But National Register designation carries with it no design control.
In Old Saybrook, the national is the Old Saybrook South Green Historic District.
Is the National Register District. Well, of course, North Cove is too. That gets a little confusing, but North Cove is both. And I do not recommend a local historic district with an ordinance unless you have good support from the folks who live there. Yeah.
We have a house on Main Street that is the old Buckingham House.
Mhm.
I was told that if we did apply to have our house in the National Registry, that we would have to open our house every year. for a
Good
house
question.
tour.
Good question. Big fat no.
Is that not true?
Not a bit. It never
Is that
was.
never true?
It never was.
Oh.
And that's one of those things that, that word flies around. And I think probably that may come from the fact that lots of historic districts have house tours. And people do open their houses up. But no, there's no requirement. There's no requirement that you put a plaque on your house. Let me think what else. It won't raise your taxes.
And how do you get the plaque changed if it's not correct? That's
Uh,
a good question.
Talk to my friend Ted Levy.
Okay.
Where you got a bad date?
Well, there was an archaeologist who was here last summer with the gentleman that was doing the archaeological dig on Saybrook Point. And he came to our house and was very excited because he said that our house was in all likelihood moved from the fort
Oh, okay.
to its present location.
Mhm.
And he actually could give us a date somewhere between 1712 and 1725. But the plaque on the house says 1671, which is
Uh-huh.
not at all correct.
Those plaques were put up locally,
Uh-huh.
so that's something to talk to. Ted, did the Historical Society do this? Oh, I'm putting you on the spot.
There was an effort years and years ago to raise funds by the Historical Society, and they sold and installed plaques, but I'm sure that this is not one of them.
Very smooth, very smooth.
Just because the house gets listed does not prevent it from being on a house tour, so keep that in mind.
Yeah, right. Now, interestingly, properties, since you said yours have been moved, properties that have been moved typically are not eligible for the National Register unless they were moved a long time ago, like 50 years or more, because they have acquired significance in their own right on that new site. Other questions? Yes?
You seem to know a lot about, obviously, for what you do with the different communities, of which is a good historical society's rules and regulations. Do you offer that as a service? Because I'm from Weathersfield, Connecticut, and Old Weathersfield has probably one of the most open fighting with the Historical Society if you have to paint the house or you're doing this. So that
okay.
sounds like one of the examples you use is saying, don't do it that way. So
Yeah.
is there templates that you offer? Or that
I've written preservation ordinances that, can be as tight or as loose as any community wants them to be. So, yeah,
The answer is yes, you offer the service.
yes,
Good.
yeah. Anything else? Christine, anything to add?
Only if anyone had any questions that they wanted to hand forward.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Up and down.
Well, thank you so much for coming out.
Thank you.
Oh, Ted, I'm sorry.
We certainly want to thank David, and if after you leave here, if you have questions or something comes to mind, or if you just are interested, please contact Christine Nelson at the Planning Department if that's the field, the area that you have an interest in, or the Old Saybrook Historical Society. We have
I'll be back. I
materials
wanna see your
for your own research and family and residences in town, and we have a large number of very capable and interested volunteers who would be delighted to help you out. Thursday mornings from 9 to 12, or call anytime, and we'll open special for special people, which all of you are. Thank you very much for coming out tonight.